Thank you. So thanks for having me. It's nice to chat about this. Of course, given all the things that we're watching right now, I'm actually away on a ski trip with some friends. So we have been spending also quite a bit of time watching Winter Olympics. And I just came from back from Italy and was able to present some of this information at a conference talking about the impact of these types of major events. So it's nice to be here and to work with Alex to chat a bit about the impact of these games on communities. And I'm particularly interested in how major events can be serve as a platform for advancing issues of disability rights, social inclusion, and social change. And in my new role as the endowed chair in sport and social impact, I'm going to focus particularly on this around Special Olympics. But today, I'm going to focus on some of the work that we've done previously, some of it with Gayle and David around Commonwealth Games, but also some work around Paralympic Games. And what are we thinking about? What do we know more generally, which will hopefully set us up well for Alex's presentation then to talk about the upcoming games that are happening in Glasgow. So to start with, a slide that I sort of tie to and think about a lot is the way that I theorize and think about sport events. Early on in my career, I would have been one of those very highly critical scholars of events, and I continue to be highly critical. But at the same time, I think we really recognize that cities, nations, and regions love them. They see the value, they see the opportunity in them, and they're really looking at the opportunity for what it can do for their region, for their city, for what's happening locally. And for me, that's really the unique piece I want to talk about is that how do we actually capitalize on that? We have to move away from the rhetoric that continues to happen. And as much as scholars, we think we've moved away from the legacy rhetoric and thought more about how we actually do this and make this happen. As I sit and listen to what's happening around the Winter Olympics, there is a lot of rhetoric going around about how this is going to be increasing participation, how all kinds of people are suddenly going to get up and start moving who haven't been moving before, and how this is going to have this wonderful impact on tourism and economic development and environmental impacts in the region. And I think we have to be very careful and cautious about making those claims without really understanding what we mean when we make those claims. So really, my interest is in thinking about how do we then use events as that seed capital? How do we think about designing those impacts well beyond the event so that we can influence the experiences of those with lived experience with disability or sport participation? So recognizing that events don't merely just do it themselves, that they create the opportunity, and that we need to be thinking about how we go about realizing that sustainable long-term outcome. And so often in the literature, you'll see the move away from the term legacy to leverage. And part of that is because we want to think about how we strategically capitalize on those resources and don't just expect the event to do it in and of itself. And recently, with some work I'm doing with Gayle and David, we're focusing more on the concept of disability rights because the human rights agenda around events has become quite predominant. We really need to be thinking more about what it means to host an event, what it means for the local region, how employment opportunities are set up, what does it mean for those who are traveling in various places. In the geopolitical climate that we're living in, we really need to be conscious of what we mean by meaningful participation. What do we really mean by non-discrimination, access, and accountability? So we're pulling from this framework around disability rights to think about that because many other areas of human rights in events have been at front and center, and we've heard a lot about them. But disability rights continues to remain at the margin, despite the fact that the Paralympic Games, for example, is celebrating, the Winter Games are celebrating its 50th anniversary this year with the Games. Ableization of sport and physical activity is predominant in these events. And often disability and accessibility and inclusion is an afterthought. So we need to think more meaningfully about what we mean by that. So let's give a little snapshot of where we are at this point. What do we know? My intention today isn't to be exhaustive in the research that we have done because it is quite extensive, but to give you some insights into a few things that we have learned that really, I think, are helping shape the next generation of events and the way that events are set up. So the first thing that we know and we've talked about early on is that event initiatives need to be informed by all stakeholders. And given our interest, we're particularly interested in ensuring that individuals with disabilities are involved in the conversation. So from the get-go. much of the legacy planning early on, even the leveraging activities with events, is driven by those with the power. Typically for people with disabilities, it's those who are non-disabled driving the conversation. Most of the leaders of our national sport governing bodies, international sport governing bodies, are individuals who do not have the lived experience of disability or do not have the lived experience of the legacy programming. So we need to be thinking very carefully about who's involved in the conversation. And I really hesitate to use the word consultation. It actually kind of irks me when we talk about consultation, because in fact, I'm not talking about consulting. I'm talking about meaningful dialogue that will impact and affect those who need to be impacted and affected by these events and who want to. So there really needs to be an ongoing dialogue. Um, we know that we've looked at previously the concept of attitudes and how events can impact the attitudes of individuals within communities, particularly around disability. There's lots of rhetoric around this. There's lots of conversation happening around this in the lead up to the Paralympic Games. I've been talking a lot about this. People have asked a lot about this. But we know that small improvements in attitudes that might happen as a result of hosting an event may not have a long-term impact. And we don't know enough about what that long-term impact really looks like. And so that's something I think that we need to investigate further. More recently, we've been investigating and evaluating long-term partnerships that have happened as a result of an event. So my colleagues and I have looked at the Pan American Games that happened in 2015. And as a part of that event, there was a strategic partnership developed between disability sport organizations, provincial sport organizations, and regional organizations. And it was really strategic in the fact that they used the event as the opportunity to come together and work together for sport participation goals in an area where they had not worked together before. But what's quite unique about this group is that they have sustained their momentum, that they continue to work together, they've secured long-term funding, and they have had long-term impacts in the region. And typically we haven't really addressed this area. We see what happens in and around event, we study the partnership that occurs, and then we don't look at it long-term. So we've been following this group 10 years post-event, and they continue to work together and they continue to impact sport participation across the region. So it's quite a unique case and probably a case that we can learn a lot from. But in doing that, we also recognize the idea that when we say we're going to impact local sport participation, one of the critical issues is capacity for involvement. When we expect an event to help develop new opportunities to be involved in sport, what we have found is, in fact, that most of the local community organizations, regional organizations, don't have the capacity. And when I say capacity in this case, that might mean sufficient qualified coaches, sufficient volunteers to support it, sufficient resources in terms of economic space or infrastructure to actually have new participants into their programs. So the idea of using events to champion new sport participation opportunities is meaningful and it's really a good idea. In fact, what we have found is that those organizations lack the capacity for new participants. And with that, we need to think about what we mean by making sure that there's social change. So how do we think about the lens that we look at in terms of social change? So we do know that there needs to be a change in direction in terms of how we position events for social change. And so that's why we're looking at the perspective of disability rights through that human rights lens. And then more recently, we're talking about the educational programming. There's lots being done. And actually, as I watched the games last night, I listened to them talk about some of the Olympic education programming that happens as an outcome of the events. And while these might be meaningful opportunities, are they sustainable? Do they actually have an impact locally? And I think we have some really good examples in some regions that Gayle and I have looked at, for example, that really did, emphasize that it's about the strategic planning and the long-term thinking. So really, I'm interested in how events create this legacy and sustainable development opportunity, particularly for people with disabilities. And as I've mentioned, we talk about it from the lens of human rights right now, and particularly disability rights. And I can go into detail if needed about the various disability rights perspectives that we're taking, but I wanted to just give you an overview of what that looks like. I think it will dovetail quite well with what Alex is going to be talking about. And two theories that I pull from, and I did talk about these recently at a conference I was at, but I want to talk about them in a little bit more detail here, is the ideas around structural violence and ableism theory. And structural violence, I think, is something that's really helpful for us in terms of understanding the ways in which individuals are systematically excluded from participating fully in life. And so that means structures, particularly economic and political structures, that preclude involvement. So while we might think it's wonderful for an event to create new participation opportunities, in fact, we need to look more broadly at those participation opportunities. Are they economically viable? Is there transportation available? Is the system set up for them to participate? So all of the pieces that really create areas of structural violence, what Galtung would call structural violence, that preclude participation opportunities. And that dovetails really well with our theories of ableism that we're drawing from, which is the idea that the world is sort of this non-disabled perspective, taken for granted as individuals possess a norm level of skills and opportunities. And so when we come at events with that lens, it makes it very difficult to really think about how we meaningfully make change and social change for these events if this is the perspective that we are all coming with. And most of us are. And so that's something that we need to start to dismantle and think about, where do those perspectives come from? And so I'm going to talk about two disability sport events. Gayle and I have talked about these events previously, but I think they're really meaningful. We have been studying Commonwealth Games since 2014. We've done some work on Paralympic Games as well. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of insight from two of the recent disability sport events that we've been working with. We've published on these, and it's sort of comparing the differences between what we know as a Commonwealth Games, which is an integrated event. So athletes with disability are part of the main sporting program. And of course, you might well know, and Alex will probably talk about this, the record number of events for individuals with disability that are going to be part of the next Commonwealth Games. So we've seen an increasing opportunity for individual athletes with disability to be part of Commonwealth Games. Then, of course, there is the model that we're seeing right now in Milano Cortina, which is the Olympic and Paralympic Games, where Olympic Games for non-disabled athletes are held for their 2-week period. There's a 2-week break, and then another 2-week period for the Paralympic Games that comes and follows that. And with that, that comes with some very interesting opportunities in terms of thinking about, how does this actually impact opportunities for sport participation, changing policy around accessibility and inclusion, changing physical infrastructure around accessibility and inclusion, things like volunteering. How do we actually impact volunteers and volunteers' understanding of participation and opportunity for individuals with disability? And so we've been doing for many years observations, conversations with people at the event, so spectators, event staff, volunteers, informal and informal interviews with key stakeholders. And so while we have a ton of data, and I'm sure David and Gayle and I could spend hours talking about this, I'm going to give you just a couple of little tidbit insights from the events. What I should mention here is there's a photo in the bottom corner of our screen that is one of my former PhD students who works closely with Commonwealth Games around their GAPS camps, which is their camp that is supporting individuals from small island nations, under-resourced nations, to increase parasport participation in the event. So has been intimately involved in these events for a long time. And we've also collected data at these particular events that often are held in between games or just prior to the games. So what are the things that we know so far from these two events? So interesting that I think there's some strong feelings around the combined format versus the distinct format. And right now I've been doing a lot of media work that is having the same discussion. Why aren't the games together? Why are they separate? Shouldn't they be all one event? And there's value in both. And I think what we have seen over the years of looking and studying at Commonwealth Games, in particular 2022 is a really good example that combined format actually worked very well. But it worked well because there are very few events that highlight individuals with disability. What was unique about 2022 in the structure of it is there was a lot of thought put into given to when those events were scheduled. So often what we had seen previously at Commonwealth Games in the combined event is that the program for individuals with disability, the events would be the last event or the very early morning event. So when there's less spectators in the stand, there isn't the people to watch the event. In 2022, they made a very concerted effort to integrate them fully into the program. So the stands were full. It was really part of the program. So I think that really makes a difference for people who are coming to watch and trying to understand. The challenge therein is there isn't necessarily always the education component that goes along with it. We get a lot of questions when we're doing our ethnographic field work if we have our research t-shirts on or something that has our university university logos on about what's actually happening. Why are these individuals competing together? What's actually going on, and how do we determine the winners, and why are there multiple medals being given out? So there isn't necessarily the same level of education that we have found sometimes in the combined event. In the Paralympic Games, given the distinct event, a lot of attention is paid to that because it is very much focused on Paralympic athletes, para athletes. And so those festival sites actually often have a lot of educational components and the resources associated with it. The nice thing in the day and age we're living is there's a lot more opportunities to do that because we have new technologies. And we saw that with the 2022 games and 2024 games is a lot more technology being used, one, to increase accessibility, but also to be educating individuals. So some of the volunteer training programs were done through app-based programming, online training, but also then apps were available for people to learn about the opportunities. What was available to them? Why were people competing in this way? What did it actually look like? And so I think that's a real advantage that's starting to happen at both of these types of events, although they do tend to be stronger and more highlighted at a Paralympic event where it is individuals with disabilities only. One of the things that I highlight, and I'll show you a picture of, is the Athletes Village. They really struggle with that with Commonwealth Games. I think it's the size and the scale of the event, and Alex can talk about some of the things that they're doing for Glasgow to really make sure that it's an accessible facility, accessible village, because the village is a really important place for athletes to gather, to socialize, to learn from one another. It is a very important and critical part of it. And one of my colleagues and I, Nancy Harrington, and I've written about the Athletes Village and the critical components for individuals with disability and how it can be very disabling and very, very exclusive if it's not set up well. And so thus far, Commonwealth Games has struggled with making that a really inclusive site, whereas Paralympic Games, particularly because of the size, scale, and resources available to them, obviously have been able to do some really interesting things with that. So I just show you some interesting pictures from the various events that we have been at. And one of the things I think that's really important to highlight is there has been significant and meaningful change over time from the events that we've studied. So Gayle and I have been working together for almost 15 years, and I can say for some of the first events that we went to, thinking about whether there was any signage about disability sport, whether there was seating, whether there was any technology, any information, was almost none. And so that's really changed, I think, over time in terms of what kinds of opportunities we see available for understanding disability sport, understanding accessibility and inclusion. Representation becomes a really critical part as well. And I always use the 2024 mascot example of the little red, I don't even know what they actually are, little red things, but they were always inclusive from the get-go. They represented the para athletes, the mascots. So those representation pieces actually really matter to people. They want to be able to see themselves in what's happening and what's going on. And so I think those are really important and critical pieces. And these spaces, what we call in our leveraging literature around the spaces of liminality, where we get to celebrate this and learn about this and come together and create a community around accessibility and inclusion. So I think these things are really meaningful changes that have happened over time. But I will say that there are continued concerns, and I have recently presented about this work, is that there's continued ableization of sport events. Particularly, I think there's still lots that needs to be done. And we hear from one of the volunteers at another event that talked about in 2022 that told us about that. Really, there's a lot that needs to be done. There might be some access and ease of mobility that needs to be considered. I think sometimes we don't think about that. When I do presentations, and I feel like my children tell me, "Don't stop talking about toilets, Mom," but toilets are such a critical part of accessibility and inclusion. And so many times at events, we see that they are inaccessible, or they're out of service, or they've just made some makeshift thing for access and inclusion. And that's not meaningful inclusion. That's somebody has thought about this is a really good idea and it's really important to us, but we're actually not going to put attention to this. And I think that's a really critical piece that we need to think about moving forward. And we have heard from government officials about the way that we all come together, but we're not really thinking about what it means to be inclusive. And a colleague of mine has talked about this extensively, the idea that in stadiums, for example, we've done a really good job of creating these wheelchair accessible sections, and people can sit with them. And athletes who use chairs can come and use specific sections for athletes, but those are always separate from individuals on their team, or they're not with their families. And we have to think about what that says to those in those sections. So you can go and sit in your specific section. What if that had a different sign? What if it said something different? Would we tolerate that? I don't think we would. So I think we need to think a little bit differently about what we really mean when we say these venues are accessible and inclusive. And I think we need to think a bit more about how we understand the way that there's institutionalized structures. So we heard a lot in our conversations with people in our interviews about, well, we can't change the program. We can't change the events. We can't change what we do. It's always set this way. Well, swimming always starts at 8 a.m. in the morning and it always finishes this way. Cycling always happens at this venue and always done this way. So the institutionalized structures really preclude us from being consciously inclusive. And so I think we can do a lot to try and break down some of that institutionalization. So I'm going to leave it and think about it. Let us think a little bit more about what do we mean by creating meaningful impacts.
Couple of minutes, Laura.
Yeah. And so so this will lead well into what Alex is to talk about, because I think future events can really think more about how they make meaningful change. Because I think we've made advances towards access and inclusion, but we need to really think about what we mean and what we want to happen locally in order to make that inclusion happen. We need to make sure that there is real recognition of the parasports. If they're going to be part of the sporting program, like in Commonwealth Games, we need to make sure that they're clearly recognized and valued. And that we still know that ableism remains pervasive in our events. If we think about the way spaces are structured, attitudes are set up, the institutional structures I talked about, and then of course our human resources. How do we think about and get individuals with disabilities involved in volunteering, in the staff, in the organizing committee, in leadership roles? And then how do we make sure everyone around them is also trained appropriately? So these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about as we move forward. And it's nice to hear that some of those things are starting to happen. So with that, I will leave it there. Thank you.
That was a whirlwind through probably 15 years, as you say, of our work, and your expertise specifically on focused on some of the social impacts and how you leverage those changes. That takes us nicely on to Alex, where we can maybe hear from him about how Glasgow are doing this in such a short turnaround, and where they've put social impact and legacy at the heart of what they're doing, when actually sometimes OCs don't need to do that. As we know, they're there to deliver games. So I think it's quite interesting that they've seconded Alex into that role to ensure that that is taking place. And really, I think it seemed quite important to have a legacy for Glasgow, because it isn't the same as a previous game. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex and not steal his thunder on that. And I've also known Alex for a number of years, not quite as long as Laura, but for a long time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gayle. Yes, my name's Alex Johnson, folks. I'm Legacy Manager at Commonwealth Sport. And as Gayle says, I'm embedded within the OC to take forward legacy planning and work with them to achieve as much social impact from a games that has been planned in a very condensed time frame. We've only had 18 months to get these games up and running, and on a much more reduced budget. So that's a kind of key thing for us. It also means I'm in a role where I take a long-term approach to my work, but I'm working with a lot of people in the OC who won't even be here after the games. So there's a much more short term, and that can present itself with challenges. And hopefully I'll capture some of that when we talk. I'll go through my presentation. I'll just share my screen. Everybody see that? Yeah. Look, it's good. Okay, so hopefully the Commonwealth Games coming to Glasgow here in less than 6 months' time, 23rd of July to 2nd of August, 11 days of integrated sport. And as I said, it was having to be done. I'm not allowed to say things like Glasgow saved the Commonwealth Games, but I think that we can say this. If Glasgow hadn't stepped up, then there would be a real issue about whether or not the games per se could be continued and sustained going for future, and that future now looks secure thanks to Glasgow. I'm going to cover just a wee bit about my kind of legacy and events background, talk a wee bit about the story of change and how we got to a story of change, and reflecting what Laura says, we've been shifted away from that language around legacy, much more around impact and benefits, and that you'll see that reflected in what we're doing around our story of change. And then really just building on legacy of Glasgow 2014. This is the second time Glasgow's hosted the Games within living memory. There's a lot already from the legacy of Glasgow 2014 that we can build on. We don't need to recreate, I should say. And then a wee bit about knowledge exchange, how we're working with others, and really just to get this knowledge out and this different model. My background is in working and volunteering in events. I work at Commonwealth Sport, but I spent 12 years at Spirit of 2012, who was taking forward the legacy from London 2012 Olympics and Paralympics. And I completely agree with Laura about those unrealistic claims. I think in London 2012, a lot of unrealistic claims were made about the Games. Sure, the Games were brilliant. Sure, they were absolutely. Paralympic Games were, I think, surpassed everybody's expectations. But this idea, suddenly everybody who was disabled was then going to go and take part in disabled sport. It did not happen after the Games because, as Laura rightly pointed out, the infrastructure wasn't there. There was no capacity for clubs to absorb that. I'm chair of Leap Sport Scotland, who take a human rights approach to our work around getting people involved in sport for LGBTQI+ groups, and I'm vice chair of my local community sports hub and on the Actify board. And part of my work has always been around using research and taking evidence-based approach. We've worked with Gayle and the team at University of West of Scotland to do some piece of research to really add to our knowledge around how we can use events to bring about change. This is what gets me up and out of bed in the morning, folks. I believe events can lead to positive change for people and communities. The reason why I believe that is I've seen it. It's not clear cut. It's not always linear, it doesn't always happen, but you need to make it happen, and you need to really have that belief that actually you can use the event as a catalyst for change. And I've done that over the last 12 years, and it's my ambition to do that now at Glasgow 2026. This is a reimagined Games. It's the language we use. Very much a different type of games because we're having to do it in less time. We're essentially pulling together the Games in 18 months. And normally this would take about 4 years to happen. And that is informed, it's good, it makes decision making a bit quicker, but it also means that there is a bit of rushing going on. We're trying to do it and things could get missed. We're building on existing venues that were here before. We're not building new stuff. We're not building new venues. We're not building an athletes village. We've got 4 existing venues that can easily accommodate the Games. So there's a real thing there around sustainability in terms of our social impact. And we've been welcoming 4,500 volunteers alongside 3,000 athletes from 74 nations and territories coming into the city during Games time. And one of the things we talk about a lot is that there is a 5th venue, and that 5th venue is the city itself, and how the Games overlay on that as well, and how we engage the city in a meaningful way around that. Laura mentioned about this being an integrated Games. It is the world's largest integrated Games. There is more parasport than mainstream sport. There's fully integrated into the programme. You can turn up, you will see different types of sports going on. You could turn up to the 3x3 basketball, and you can see mainstream provision, and then suddenly there's a parasport equivalent of that happening at the same time. So that Games is very integrated. The first gold medal will be a parasport medal in this game. And this is a different model, and we're trying to capture that model, a model that we're spending £150 million in Glasgow and hosting this game. The last time Glasgow hosted it in 2014, we spent over 500 million on the Games. Birmingham spent over 700 million pounds on the Games in 2022. So it's a very different version of it in terms of a model that we're using to spend and get the Games delivery and therefore achieve that impact. And what does that mean in terms of social impact and legacy for that? And hopefully this will be a model that others can use and pick up going forward into Malta next year at the Commonwealth Youth Games and the 20 to 30 games that will now, Commonwealth Games that are now going to be in India. What can we capture from this model to share with them? We talk about our model of sustainable practice, and the slides here kind of capture some of that. That idea about working with the rhythm of the city, using existing events. 3 of our venues are all on the same train line. You could walk to them. They've got bus routes and all that. It's a different financial model, that much more reduced expenditure on the Games. And also, athletes will be staying in hotels. They won't be staying in a big fancy new athletes village. They'll be staying in the hotels near venues. So really drilling in, we're designing sustainability around the whole model, and the whole model is kind of centered around that and around a much reduced expenditure for the games as well as a result of that. This is our story of change. It will be familiar to Gayle and David and others from the centre because they helped us co-create it. And I won't go through all of this. I'll be here all day, but we'll be able to share the slides with you. But I'll just draw your attention to a couple of things around this. One is our cost-cutting impact drivers. These are the drivers, and I've been saying to folks, and I've got one here around a much more greener games, using existing venues, looking at the circular economy, looking how we reduce waste from those events. That's not easy. It's difficult. We're working with partners. We need to get them on board. We're working with partners that might not share the same views, but that's the ambition. Inclusive games, building on, it's an integrated games where disabled and non-disabled people can take part in the games. But what does that mean for sport? What does that mean for audiences? What does that mean for people who are coming to the games and actually going to see the games? How can they experience the games in different ways? Not everyone is going to be able to afford a ticket. Not everyone is going to be able to get a ticket. So how can the people in Glasgow and Scotland and the Commonwealth experience the games? This is a welcoming city. It's a city that knows how to do events. It's done events. It's did the games in 2014. And actually, how can we enhance the skills of that event sector in Glasgow and others through that? And how can we create programmes that allow people to feel welcomed and then can engage in through sport, arts and culture? And then finally, the one designing a financially responsible place-based event for host cities and nations. It's not often in a strategic objective for an event or the impact of the event that you get to see the word financially responsible in there, which is slightly reflecting what the games are around. But actually, that's a really important part of what we're doing here. How do we capture the model? How do we demonstrate value for money? Also, how do we demonstrate that value for money can still lead to social and meaningful social impact? And these drivers, as I say to my colleagues, these are not the end point, they're actually the starting point that takes us through to this last one there. You can see about how what we put input, we can't do it without partners, and that's the key part of this. And there'll be immediate outcomes, there'll be some goals that we want to achieve around the 5 wealth model, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then this part here, the long-term impacts, the lasting benefits. We've deliberately not used the word legacy here, although I've put it in here. That might sound strange from someone who's got legacy in their job title, but we recognise that that word can often be loaded. Some people are very sceptical of it, but actually what are we saying here? This is about long-term impact and benefits. That's what we actually mean from when we talk about legacy. These are the 6 long-term impacts that we're trying to achieve. One around a new area of sport for the Commonwealth Games, this new model that we're creating. What does that mean for the future of the Games going forward? We're looking at a more connected, proud and confident host city and nation. This is the city that's done it before. We worked ourselves, and Gayle and David and the team, a couple of years ago, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of Glasgow 2014. We asked people questions around this. Like 76% of 1,200 people we asked were still saying 10 years on, the games made me feel proud of my city, which is a living legacy. Right? So how do we build on that? It's going to be a smarter, more sustainable blueprint for future events. We're talking about a talented pool of skilled and diverse major events workforce for Scotland. So future-proofing that workforce and adding to it, then that's looking at what we can do. Although we did the games 12 years ago, this is a very different city from 12 years ago, and this is a different version of the games. And then what, Laura mentioned there about increased community sporting culture with strengthened participation pathways. We are not making any promises here about the Glasgow Games will lead to 1 million people in Scotland getting active. We just know that that's unrealistic, and often these things, we set yourself up for failure. So for us, it's much more being realistic about that increased engagement, strengthening the existing pathways that are there already, and how we can help that, but not making any big claims around that the games itself will lead to increased participation, because the evidence around that is quite patchy. And in that global recognition of Glasgow, Scotland and the UK as pioneers of major events. And so they all feel quite realistic to me. None of them scare me. I don't think that we're setting ourselves up for impacts that we can't achieve. That's what there may be some differences in there about, but I think that they feel quite realistic given the games model that we've got, that we can certainly work with partners, and working with partners is the kind of key part of that to achieve that sort of impact and those sort of benefits. And then just thinking about, okay, building legacy, what is it we've done differently here? We're calling this a reimagined game. So what makes it reimagined to us? I think the first thing to say is that we're hosting the games again, but we're doing it within living memory of the last time. So what does that mean, actually? Well, it means for us, a lot of the key people, a lot of the organisations that were involved in Glasgow 2014 and its legacy are still here, still in those roles, still working. So essentially what we're doing is we're pushing on an open door often when we're having those conversations about we want to create a legacy around well-being. Who do we speak to? We know who to go to. So there's a lot, it's very efficient in our time in that, and to say, and there's a real willingness. Ever since we started this, we've just been pushing on open doors. We're building on a legacy of Glasgow 2014. We've got things that were created, those new venues. We've got this extensive cycle network that we didn't have. So looking at what's already there and saying, well, how can this version of the games can add value and layer on top of that? What can we do to build on those legacy programs that are still in existence and still going? We're focusing on change and benefits. We don't have a legacy plan. We have a story of change, which is about change and using the language of benefits, which are short-term and long-term benefits, and being realistic about what they are. We've fused together public engagement and legacy. I came into post and these were separate. But what we learned quite quickly is you can't build a legacy from the games if people don't know the games are happening. So you need to tell them and get out there, engage with communities and let them know. We're testing Commonwealth Sport's new 5 wealths model. This is a model, you'll see it in the story of change there. We're looking at sporting wealth, cultural wealth, social wealth, economic wealth, diplomatic wealth. This is created by Commonwealth Sport, about how we can demonstrate the value of the games. Previous versions and iterations of the games, they all do this very differently. So it makes it very difficult to compare like for like. And this is a model that will hopefully in the future allow us to compare different games and how we can demonstrate the real value of the games. Working in partnership, first thing we did was have an academic partner as our partner, the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events. Really from day one, pretty much. I finished work on Friday at Spirit 2012. On Monday I started, and one of the first meetings I had was with Gayle and David about, okay, how do we work together, and that idea that you engage an academic partner. So through that work, we co-created the story of change. I agree with you, Laura. I don't like the word consultation. It's too woolly. It's not meaningful. We were actually co-creating. We were listening to people and asking them what can change from the games and who's that change for, and how we then can co-create our story of change and result. We've created a new group of story of change champions here across the OC, because a lot of people are in roles where they finish right after the games. So they might think long-term social impact, long-term benefits, or legacy, I use that word, is not for them. So we're trying to engage them and says, actually, you'll find out some of this is from you if we just use our resources and our intel and be a bit more smarter about how we work across different functional areas. And we've been co-creating programs with our partners. Every time we're doing a program, so who's our lead partner? The partner will be here when we're not here, that can pick up the baton, to use a kind of games pun, and take that forward and keep that going. And then really just 2 exciting things for me that as well, the Glasgow 2026 Legacy Network, which is led by the Centre. I mean, really, we're supporting that work. We're launching the network at the end of this month. We've had great engagement, great number of people enjoying it, where we can bring people together to collaborate, to find out what people are doing, to understand what's being doing, to measure the impact of what people are doing, but really that stronger focus on legacy that goes beyond the games, and not that kind of short-termism that is just, it's only about before the games and during games. And then all in is our new programme that we want to create a legacy from, where we're using this new brand here you'll see on there, being mindful of the brand police that often happens with games, the Commonwealth Games and other big multi-sport events. You can't use this because of sponsorship. So creating an inclusive brand that can engage schools, community groups and businesses, and allow them to associate with the games in a really meaningful way and show that they're part of the game's impact and part of its long-term benefits as well. And we will use that again if hopefully in future games as it actually becomes a bit of a model for that. So, and then just join our legacy network. And there's a wee QR code there. We'll send that out to you. I've been promoting this. We'll be launching this at the end of the month. I think we've already got 50 people coming to here where I'm sitting just now in the clubhouse to start that engagement, to start that journey and start talking about legacy and thinking about that. And then knowledge exchange, just finally, we're doing a lot of that, thinking about it's not what we're doing, but how we're doing it and how we're sharing it. Things like I'm doing today with you guys is part of that work. So connecting and our transfer of knowledge. We're now just about to go live with impact measurement. Yes, I agree with you. We should have done this 6 months ago, but we've just been finalising budgets to make sure that we're measuring the impact. And we won't measure everything, but we'll just measure what we can, that we know will demonstrate that. We've got programmes around campus to Commonwealth that's engaging with the universities. I've been engaging with the universities as well through academic engagement. And then just thinking, what's next? Malta 2027 in India. What can we do now here around social impact and around legacy benefits that we can capture and share with them and they can use for their version of the game. So I think that's it, folks. Just say see you in the summer. If you're able to, come here and join us. And for our reimagined games, that will be an altogether brilliant game. So I'm going to stop sharing and thank you for your time.
Sorry, my mouth had disappeared
Yeah, I was
there.
just going to say you're
I
still on
know,
mute.
no, I knew them. I just couldn't get there. Thank you so much. That was excellent, Alex and Laura, and I think they dovetailed really nicely in terms of some of the issues, both around how you'd address issues of accessibility with their inclusive policies and how you were actually, you know, having been forced into, not forced, but like the opportunity came and you accepted the challenge of delivering a games. I think it was interesting you're saying you could do that because we delivered the games previously in 2014 and some of the people were there. I think often you get asked questions around what are you know, what are the benefits to cities and things like that. And Glasgow's role is maybe quite unusual in some cities when that they have a talent pool, that they developed that, and that they are an eventful city, that people like yourself stayed. And do you think? I think that's quite important. But anyway, enough from me. I'm going to go on and ask questions because we've got 10 minutes, and there are a lot of questions on here that have come up on the chat. So let me just see if I can go through some of them. And nice to see people saying where they're from. It looks like we've got people from all over the world. So, somebody asking, could you provide a comparison between the Commonwealth Games and the Paris Games in terms of accessibility, or you provided that in the Paris Games in terms of accessibility. It says, what would you identify as a defining characteristics of winter sports in this context? I think that's more aimed at Laura.
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, I probably should mention one of the questions I've been getting asked quite a bit lately is about winter games and winter sports. And there's very limited research on winter sport events. In fact, from the perspectives that Alex and I have talked about, in terms of accessibility, of course, this is a critical issue. If we think about Milano Cortina and the structure, the new structure that it is this year, being held in two different cities, very far apart, you know, 5.5 hours through the mountains, mountain sites at one place, so far apart from another. There are obviously some significant accessibility challenges that are being presented. So I really couldn't comment because we have very limited research on winter events. Yeah.
How do you think that some of these, like the events, are able to portray in a meaningful way that they are actually dealing with issues of accessibility and social impact?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, also for Alex, you know, your role has been through some of the legacy network, but in other ways to ensure that communities feel that they're involved. And the question sort of goes on to ask about, they'd like to hear insights on how national level policies and social awareness factors comes into comparison. But I'm thinking more broadly in that, and how that message is translated into the games, even if you don't have a ticket, are actually for you.
Mm-hmm.
Take Laura, then Alex.
That's a big question. So I think, I think the question initially is about the sort of impact of national level policies on how this is developed. And I think we have to recognize that we're looking at two pretty progressive policy contexts in terms of accessibility and inclusion, being in the UK and Canada, or Scotland and Canada, where there is national level policies focused on access and inclusion. And so this is a broader agenda. So the event fits really well and nicely into this. And for the events that we've studied, we've been able to capitalize on that, right? When there's a national policy agenda around access and inclusion, the event can create the resources, the opportunities to do the things that many communities might not be able to do otherwise and impact that. Where we get I think a little bit nervous about things is in regions of the world where access and inclusion aren't valued in the same way. There are issues of representation. And so I think what we found in previous events is a lot of tokenism around this. The whole notion that everybody, after the Beijing Games, everybody felt better about disability is highly problematic to suggest that. Were there meaningful changes? Were there meaningful policy changes? Yes. But does that mean it changed an entire nation of millions of people? No, it didn't. So I think we have to be really cautious about thinking about what a games that's the size of what Glasgow is trying to do and the impact on national policy versus what Alex, I think, has very clearly articulated. This is a Glasgow Games. It's about making meaningful impact in that region. And that is so significant.
Yeah, I think Alex, maybe you could come in on that as well, but also looking at sometimes the pressure is on you at the moment for Glasgow to say, what are you doing for Glasgow, but what are you also doing for the rest of the Commonwealth next? Where is, because you've set yourself up saying there's a model, this is a new model. They're saying, well, how is that new model going to be implemented?
Yeah, and even just in the Glasgow context, even just from an OCE perspective, that accessibility piece, it's a mixed bag. We are not always getting this right at the moment, and we're sending out mixed messages. So often I have conversations with colleagues who think that accessibility is just about accessibility to the venues. And I'm like, it is more than that. And accessibility to the venues is really important, yes. But the vast majority of people that are going to experience the games here in Glasgow, Scotland, and the Commonwealth are not going to be in the venue. They're going to be experiencing it in different ways. So for me, earlier on, engaging, we've got the good thing is we have an accessibility manager here in the OC that's part of Trivandi, and they're our event delivery partner. So there's a person to drive this forward, and I can work with them on that on that piece. And from the big get-go, I was saying to them, in a Glasgow context, bear in mind, we've got a lot of deprivation in this city. So not a lot of people can afford to go to the games anyway. So what that means is we need to take the games to them. This is an outreach approach as part of what we're doing. So we'll let them go and experience the games. So the public engagement team, all this lovely public engagement equipment they bought where people can come along and try stuff. Okay, how do we get it into Scotstoun and deprived areas in Scotstoun, which is right next to the stadium? How do those people get to try that? So actually, it's less about a passive model, more about us going to places and going to people instead of waiting for them to kind of come to that. And as I said, we don't always get it right. So as you saw before Christmas, we announced for the very first time, this version of the games is going behind a paywall on television with the deal that's been struck with TNT. There's a lot of people in here think that's a great idea. It's wonderful for sport and it's wonderful for the games. And then when you push back and say, yeah, but that means a lot of people will not be able to watch it. And they said, yeah, but it's only £3 like a week. It's a really reduced model. I went, but if you have no money, or on a really fixed income that there's no, then that's not for you. So actually then, how do we get people into places where they can come along and watch the games? And then they can do all that. And from a Commonwealth perspective, Gail, we're going to be creating lots of resources.
So just to ask there, are you going to have live sites then?
We are. We're going to have live sites.
That's not necessarily been publicised, so just to...
We're going to have spaces where people can go. We're engaging with organisations in Glasgow, either pubs, community spaces, or areas where the people can come and watch it on big screens and do all that kind of stuff. So we're really be pushing that. And we're like, actually, you can just come along, take part in the festival, and then you can go over there and you can watch it on a big screen. That's the idea that we're going to be really building that. And then just when you mentioned, Gail, about that from a Commonwealth perspective, we're going to be creating lots of resources we're creating, our schools programme is going to create a whole range of school-based programmes for the curriculum. We want to share that with the Commonwealth. Commonwealth Sport will own that after the games, and we're going to be pushing that out and saying, who else wants to see these? Who else wants to use them? Because there are some great resources that can be applied in different school settings in different places. So I think for me, it's just making sure we have the conversation and include the Commonwealth in our thinking and pushing that, because if we don't, it will get missed.
And what's in that, Alex?
So in those programmes, we've got global citizenship ideas. We've got organisations like Street Games, Sporting Memories, the British Council, Youth Sport Trust, bringing their education resources around well-being, social studies, PE, all of that, to bring that in and create this. So teachers have a wealth of Commonwealth games or Commonwealth themed resources that they can use as part of the education curriculum and use the games as a way of engaging young people around that. So, but we want to share them with everybody because we're all in. That means not just Glasgow and Scotland, that includes the Commonwealth for us.
I wondered when you were going to get that phrase in at the
It's
back.
compulsory, sorry.
I know. Perhaps one of the questions in the chat is also said, since Glasgow is hosting the games again, following the 2014 edition, what new legacies do you expect to create by building upon the foundations that you already had from 2014? And is there anything that failed in 2014 that you're hoping to revitalise or reinforce through the games this time?
Yeah, I think for me, kind of standout one is I don't think we did a really meaningful public health legacy from Glasgow 2014. I feel there was a bit of a gap around that. And we've been conscious of that from this games and like conscious of not saying like Glasgow 14 was kind of guilty of it as well. We're going to inspire everybody to take part in sport and physical activity. And we're like, well, that's just not realistic for a large part of our population. But we can build on the games around that. And the people who are sporty and want to take part in sport, they're going to do that anyway. They don't need the games for that. So this time what we're actually looking at is a legacy of movement. How do we just get people moving? We don't, particularly people with long-term health conditions, of which there is many in this city and across Scotland. They get excluded from this all the time. So actually, how do we use the National Day of Movement on the 18th of June this year to use the games to get people out and moving? And to be honest, we don't care how they move as long as they move, and really build a legacy around. We talk about sport and physical activity. Let's start talking about sport, physical activity and movement, and how all movement is valued. So for me, that's what I'm drilling into, that legacy. Let's create a legacy of movement thanks to this games.
And Laura, just for you to finish off there, and conscious of the time for everybody, there's a question from David on, often that momentum wanes after a games is gone. How do you stop that fiscal cliff in a sense, and how do you keep driving forward? And in terms of the momentum of keeping things going, is it always bidding for those next games, or is it doing something differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think a little bit more strategically from a city, a region, and nation perspective of what the goals are, right? I think there isn't a one size fits all perspective on this, and so colleagues of mine at we know have written about the idea around events portfolio. So what actually works in your region? What would you like to see happen? Small, large, health affairs, festivals, culture events, sport events. So creating the right mix of things to keep a type of momentum that's meaningful and strategic for your city and your region is what's valued. And then having the right mix of people. Alex is a great example of having the right knowledge and resources and support for sustaining those goals in the area is critical, but it's not easy to do. And I don't think we should be expecting every area that hosts events to be doing this. And so I think we put a lot of emphasis on the values and what we think events should deliver, but we don't really think about the broader mix of what's meaningful and valued for a region. So I think I really like to see what happens with these games because, it's meaningful and it's small scale. Let's do this in a very strategic, meaningful way that's going to be impactful. And let's not make these giant promises, which is often what happens with events. And then they don't come to fruition. And then everybody gets upset about that. Let's do things that are meaningful and then they can be sustained.
I think that's a great summary of that. Alex, you we're wanting to say them? No, all good. I think it's a great place to finish up, and thanks for everybody who was on the call. I think we had about 40 people at one stage, so some really interesting discussion and questions. The recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel that you can listen back to it, and please get in touch with anyone, either our speakers or through the centre if you want to catch up with us separately. And as Alex had said, if you are in Scotland, please feel free to come along to our Legacy Network event launch. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thanks, Gail.